And with that, we move on to our next talk. We have the very kind Tom Poole, who is the director of JUCE and also part of the Audio Developer Conference team as well. And he's going to be giving an interview, an overview of the new features upcoming in JUCE 7, and also going to say a little bit about all of the cool things that are coming up for ADC. And with that, I will hand over the mic to Tom. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So yeah, before we sort of dive into an overview of the main features of JUCE 7, it's kind of important that we take a few minutes to talk about the Audio Developer Conference, because we are, well, a couple of weeks ago, we opened our talk submissions platform. And if you're interested in giving a talk, there's only a couple of weeks left for you to do that. The actual conference itself takes place between the 14th and 16th of November, in person in London, but also online as well. And given this audience is already sort of tuned into watching talks about audio, I won't preach to the converted about how much like fun and useful it is. But the submissions is the pressing thing. So if you're thinking of being part of this year's ADC, now is your chance. If you've not given a talk before, or your area of work or what you're doing or your background is atypical, we'd particularly welcome your contribution. Once we've collected all the submissions from everybody, the talks are ranked by public anonymized voting. So if your talk sounds interesting, or whatever it may be, it can become part of the ADC program. Talks are 50 minutes. We have plenty of examples from previous years on our YouTube channel, so you can just look out for free. And if you want to find out more about any of that, the website is audio.dev. So go there, find out a bit more about the program, and submit a talk. So switching.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to interrupt and say I'm going to put the link in the chat as well. So it's audio.dev for everybody. And as Tom was saying, if you've never given a talk on audio development before, and you're looking for ways to get exposure into the industry or show people your perspectives on audio programming, I don't think that I can think of a better place to do this other than the Audio Developer Conference. Some of the leading developers and leading people in the industry are there. It's been a huge influence in my career, and I think it's an essential place to go if you want to get serious about audio development, and meet and network with other people who are interested in these things as well. So even if you're not sure if your proposal or your idea for a talk is ready yet, don't be scared to submit to the page. And it's a great opportunity for growth, and I can't say enough great things about it. So be sure to check it out. If you haven't bought a ticket yet, I encourage you to do so. I'll see you in November.
I mean, that is a little difficult at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, the tickets are on sale. Yeah.
But yes, please, when tickets do go on sale, that'd be wonderful. And if you wanted to say meet the JUCE team, we're always there, and everyone is very welcome to head over to the JUCE bit and say hello.
Yeah.
So back on JUCE, we could talk about things like upcoming features of the framework. And we've committed to a few recently. So on release, JUCE 7 will contain support for the Audio Random Access SDK, which I'll refer to from now on as ARA, the Lvt plugin format, both hosting and authoring Lvt plugins, new graphical rendering modes on macOS and iOS, and hardware synced rendering on Windows, macOS, and iOS. Coming a little later, but still part of JUCE 7, but not part of the initial release. So this would be something like JUCE 7.1 or maybe 7.2, is Midi 2 support, more accessibility improvements, and a revamp of our animation clutches, which will tie in to the new hardware synced drawing. We're also hoping to be able to make creating AAX plugins much easier. We've had some really positive discussions with Avid about this, but at least at the moment, we can't commit to saying much more, or even if something along those lines would be part of JUCE 7, but things are in motion. If you were at last year's ADC, or the talk has gone up on the YouTube channel, there is a talk from Avid where you can sort of get a sense of what that might be. Things are in motion. So the ARA support presents plugins with a much more sophisticated API where they can read audio samples outside of the normal time constraints of real-time audio. And when you're not tied to the playhead and a fixed sequence of buffers that come with it, plugins can operate more like sample editors. The poster child for this is Celemony's Melodyne, which, if you haven't seen it in action yourself, allows you to sort of jump around in time and fix audio like you are editing MIDI. It's very impressive, and with ARA support in JUCE, you can create plugins that do similar kinds of things. It's a really rich interface. It's quite a complicated interface. If you're just getting started out with JUCE, then try a normal plugin first. There's really quite a lot going on here, but it is extremely powerful, and we're quite excited to see what people can do with it. Lvt Plug-In Supports. This is really useful because as an Lvt author or host, you get access to a wider variety of platforms and different communities. This has particular impact in open source circles and projects where so the only thing that could be considered is strict open source. And as JUCE is an open source GPL framework ourselves, this is something we want to help support. Rendering improvements are also included in the initial JUCE 7 release. So on macOS and iOS, we have a new default. We've had an asynchronous drawing mode hidden behind a feature flag for those people who are interested in it for years, at least 1 year. So that's had a lot of testing. We've weathered a lot of use cases, and that is now going to become the new default. And the potential performance gains are really quite substantial. We have also fixed our option to force Apple devices to not consolidate disparate rendering regions. So years ago, back in macOS 10, 12 or something, plus or minus one or two versions, you could ask macOS for the list of dirty recs when you came to do your drawing. Now this is really helpful if you have, like comes up every now and then in plugin GUIs, you have some input meters on your left and some output meters on your right. And if both of those change simultaneously, the consolidated dirty rec that Apple sends back to you might be the entirety of your GUI, even though only two little bits at the edge have changed. The Apple does have an API that lets you query this, but it's been broken since that old version of macOS. With G7, we've made that work again by rendering into our own metal layer and taking like really full control over how updates get presented to the screen. So if you have a GUI that is currently redrawing much bigger areas than it needs to, then re-enabling this option might be a really dramatic change for the better. It's very sort of application dependent. It really depends exactly what your GUI is doing, and you'll want to try this out. The other rendering related change is hardware synced drawing. So now GUI invalidation regions are batched and drawing commands are only issued when the screen will actually be updated. This gives us automatic support for Apple's ProMotion displays that feature like an adaptive display rate. And on Windows in particular, this eases pressure on the main GUI thread. Before G7, you can get into situations where the main message thread was flooded with messages about tiny invalidation regions, like tens of thousands of them in the worst case. But now we're bringing that back down to a single message at the rate of which your display or displays are refreshing. And then this means that your whole application isn't bogged down. We plan to do this for Linux and Android too, but it's just Windows, macOS, iOS for the initial release. Midi 2 is coming. If you dig around the JUCE code base at the moment, you'll see that we have an internal Midi 2 API that we haven't yet exposed to the public. We've been waiting for a few things. So one is platform support. Apple has published their Midi 2 API, and much more recently, so has Google in Android. We are, because we want to support all of them, it would be really nice to know what Microsoft requires us to do before we put out an API that might be incompatible with their particular dance. And we'd also like some devices. There are a few around, but with some help from the Midi Association, we're going to get some test hardware pretty soon. So although we're not in direct control of both of those factors, we are confident enough that over the course of G7, we will have resolved both of those, and we'll be able to sort of publish our Midi 2 API. Accessibility. JUCE 6 introduced an entirely new accessibility framework within JUCE. And since then, we've had several of our larger customers adopt it. And what's really nice about large customers is they have huge testing facilities and access to many more people than we can reach. So we have lots of really excellent feedback from all of that. And we're committed to implementing like the most important new feature requests off the back of that in G7. So accessibility will keep getting better. And the last thing I mentioned was a revamp of our animation classes. With the introduction of hardware synced drawing, we can plumb those screen refresh changes up to our users. And this will mean that user created animations can run much more efficiently. In the sense that this will be like working with OpenGL, where you get a callback where you need to provide new content. And this means that you can do a minimal amount of drawing whilst also updating every frame that you need to. So that's it. That was a very quick blast through the headline features. And I think we now have a time for a few questions.
Great. Thanks for that, Tom. Leon Skeptic asks, is there any Visual Studio Code exporter yet for the producer? Assuming that you'd probably have to use CMake for that. Am I right in saying that?
We don't have a Visual Studio Code exporter, but as Josh said, we do support CMake, and there is at least one very well supported CMake integration in VS Code. So that would be the way to go there.
Great. What about clap support? Is that up and coming in JUCE?
We have no immediate plans to support clap. There's plenty of discussions about it, but at the moment, clap support doesn't actually buy our users anything that they can't get with the other plugin formats. So the sticking point here seems to be, if you're a plugin manufacturer, and most of our users are, you need to support Cubase, so you have a VST3. You need to support Logic, so you have an AU, and like now we have Lvt for like all the rest. And between those, you get complete DAW coverage. So if we throw clap into the mix, you can also have a clap version of your plugin, but it's extra complexity for no more addressable market. Maybe things will change. So I'm really personally supportive of the clap movement. I think it's a very good thing to get going. But at the moment, for JUCE users, I just go on the forum and look at the most requested things or the top voted feature requests. There's much more clamoring for us to be working on them rather than clap. So it might take a while for it to sort of bubble up in importance.
Great. At Sushi asks, when will you go for web or WebAssembly? Is that in development for JUCE?
It's something we think about a lot. I think that is probably the future of JUCE. So this isn't me committing to anything, but the way we would do that is that last year it was possible to get a web view in Windows that was as capable as all of the other platforms, and that was kind of what was holding us back. And we're now in a position where if we're using the modern web views on all of the platforms, then it is really feasible to write a GUI using HTML, JavaScript, all your lovely web technologies, and have some kind of hook in the back of that where your JavaScript could talk to C++. There's at least one video by the folk at Output who've tried this approach with JUCE, just with their own functionality built on top of it. And that appears to be working well for them. So yeah, this is something we would consider putting into JUCE directly.
Great. What about GPU processing support? So you have OpenGL. What about Metal or Vulkan?
So this is difficult. I think the future may be web GPU and a wrapper that sits on top of all platforms. So the problem with, so JUCE's sort of main selling point is that you write code once and it runs everywhere. If you write some Metal code, that is only going to work on Apple devices. If you write some Vulkan code, it's not going to work on most Windows computers because the driver support just isn't there yet. Like it's not going to be reliable enough that you can just run Vulkan and it will work everywhere. And Apple's a pain. There's some sort of adapter layers that you can add to your app, but it sounds nice in principle. If you actually try to use them, they're a real headache. So that leaves a few things. There's two projects from Google. One is Angle, which lets you write GL. Not sure of the exact version, but the one that's most common in web browsers. And that translates that into native calls on each platform. So you write for that specific version of OpenGL, and that will be translated into Metal on Apple devices, for example. Or we work towards WebGPU. And again, Google has a framework called Dawn, which does the same for web GPU commands. It translates them into the native GPU on each platform. We're still looking at both of those.
Great. Another question, what about Wayland support?
That's on our to-do list, yes.
What's Wayland?
The successor to X is a sort of GUI manager for primarily Linux.
Got it. Great. That looks like all of our questions. Yes, that's all of our questions. Thank you very much, Tom. Yes. And before we go, just another quick shout out to the Audio Developer Conference. If you haven't submitted a talk and you're considering doing a talk, be sure to submit. What are you waiting for? You can go to audio.dev to submit. And with that, we can wrap things up. Thank you once again to everybody who joined us, and we will see you next month.